You're nothing but a walking corpse now, Mother. Don't let this hospital die with you. The birthday wish for my 70th year didn't come with a cake or a celebration. It arrived in the form of a sentence, cold and jagged, like a surgical blade pulled from a tray of ice. Julian stood there, framed by the dying Boston sunlight that filtered through the expansive windows of the Miller Medical Center. The light hit his shoulders, but it failed to penetrate the chilling frost, radiating from his face, a face that was becoming more of a stranger's with every passing second. His eyes were glued to the cranial CT scan mounted on the lightbox, his fingers obsessively adjusting his cufflinks. It was a nervous tick. I knew all too well the telltale sign of a Miller man hiding a catastrophic lie. Beside him was Sienna, my daughter-in-law, the anesthesiologist who had long ago traded her Hippocratic oath for a collection of blood-stained diamonds. She slid a thick manila folder toward me with hands that trembled not with grief, but with the calculated precision of a scripted performance. "The biopsy results are devastating, Mother," she said, her voice thin and brittle. "Stage 4 pancreatic adenocarcinoma. Your CA 19 to 9 levels are screaming into the thousands. In our world, they call it the silent killer. But then again, you taught us that, didn't you?" I didn't touch the file. My hands remained steady on the mahogany desk, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in my chest. Instead of reading their forged papers, I read them. I watched the shallow, rapid rise of Julian's chest. I saw the microspasms in his jawline. As a diagnostic expert who had spent 40 years peeling back the biological veils of thousands, these physiological betrayals were louder than any written report. My own son was lying to me, and the air in the room was thick with the suffocating stench of a coup. "Face the reality, Mother. The clock has run out." Julian stepped into my personal space, his voice dropping into a low, predatory growl. He was no longer a son. He was a vulture, waiting for the pulse to stop. "Sign the administrative transfer for the Miller Foundation. We'll get you to Switzerland. Don't let this empire be buried alongside your rotting body." Suddenly, a sharp, caustic burn flared in my upper abdomen. It hit me like a physical blow. Right after I had finished the Earl Grey tea Sienna had so thoughtfully prepared. I didn't wince. I slowly raised my hand, subtly pressing my index and middle fingers against my radial pulse. 110 beats per minute. Forced tachycardia. It was a biological impossibility for a terminal pancreatic patient in my alleged condition to have a heart racing with such artificial intensity. My eyes flickered toward the cranial CT scan they were using as their metastasis evidence. I saw the opacity in the frontal lobe. To a general practitioner, it was a death-dealing tumor, but to my eyes sharpened by decades of imaging mastery, it was a clumsy manipulation of the reconstruction algorithm, a digital ghost, a malignant illusion. I feel quite lightheaded. I wheezed, intentionally fracturing my voice to match the frail image they wanted to see. I need one night to think, to say my goodbyes to this office." Sienna's hand was on my shoulder instantly, her touch cold as a cadaver. "We're only doing this because we love you, Mother. The sooner you sign, the sooner you can find peace." I waved them away with a feeble gesture, closing my eyes to hide the lethal clarity igniting in my pupils. I heard Julian's suppressed sigh of relief, the arrogant, rhythmic strike of his heels on the marble floor, and then the final, heavy thud of the door. It sounded exactly like a coffin lid snapping shut. The moment the lock clicked, the facade of the dying old woman vanished. I stood up, my mind a cold, calculating machine. I walked over to the desk and picked up the half-empty teacup, bringing it to my nose. Beneath the citrus scent of bergamot was a faint, acrid chemical undertone. They were drugging me. My own children were poisoning my blood while they forged my death on paper. I grabbed my secure phone, my voice dropping into a tone that was terrifyingly sharp. Audit the pharmacy's central inventory. Now, every neuroinhibitor and sedative issued to Dr. Sienna's surgical wing this week. I want the logs on my private server in 10 minutes. No excuses. As I prepared to end the call, my eyes locked onto that CT scan one last time under the high-intensity LED backlight. A detail I had missed in my initial shock suddenly crystallized. That shadow in the frontal lobe, it wasn't a tumor at all. It was the ghost image of a micro-titanium surgical clip. The blood in my veins turned to liquid nitrogen. That specific clip was only used in elite neurosurgical procedures I had never undergone. Someone else had been carved open to create this image. Someone else's tragedy was being used as the template for my execution. This game is filthier than I ever imagined, I whispered into the darkening room. My son hadn't just written my death sentence. He had signed it in the blood of another innocent soul. Under the lens of a microscope, the truth never wears a rose-colored tint. But lies? Lies are always meticulously stained with expensive reagents. Tonight, I am not searching for the death Julian so eagerly predicted. I am searching for the proof of my own life, right here in the den they call the most advanced laboratory in Boston. If they want to use medicine to execute me, I will use my own mastery to unmask their treachery. 2 a.m. The corridors of Miller Medical Center are hauntingly silent, vibrating with a monochromatic hum from the ventilation system. I walk through the halls I've paced for 4 decades, but tonight, my heels have been replaced by soft-soled shoes to erase every sound of my existence. The burning in my epigastrium remains a dull, corrosive reminder of that toxic tea, but my mind is unnervingly sharp. It is the cold, crystalline lucidity of a predator that has been cornered and left with no choice but to bite back. My keycard still works. A soft, clinical beep echoes, and the lab door swings open, releasing a draft of dry, chilled air and the pungent, chemical scent of formalin. I head straight for the digital pathology scanners, my eyes searching for the specific sample labeled AD70. The pancreatic biopsy Sienna personally harvested from my body last week. Her hands had been so tender then. I realize now they were merely the hands of a butcher weighing the meat. I slide the glass slide into the tray. A beam of intense blue light pierces the thin glass, and the cellular landscape immediately floods the 4K monitor. My heart beats with a steady, surgical rhythm. If this were truly terminal pancreatic adenocarcinoma, as Julian's forged report claimed, the screen before me should be a battlefield of utter chaos. I should see monstrous cells, enlarged and distorted nuclei, and an aggressive invasion shattering the basement membrane like a pack of hungry demons. But as I stare at the screen, I find only an eerie, deafening silence. The cells are too organized. They divide with a rhythmic regularity that mocks Julian's diagnosis. They lack pleomorphism, the essential chaotic hallmark of malignancy. I adjust the magnification, focusing on the staining technique. Typically, an H&E stain produces purple nuclei and pink cytoplasm. But here, the purple has an unnatural hue, leaning toward a synthetic cobalt blue at the edges of the cell membranes. I let out a faint, bitter smile that tastes like ash. Julian, my own son, you were too reckless in your greed. He had taken a benign specimen, perhaps a simple fibroadenoma, and soaked it in a specialized chemical dye to make the nuclei appear darker, more ominous, more deadly to a doctor who only had time for a cursory glance. He wanted to turn a harmless lump into a death sentence, written in black and white. He didn't just want my hospital. He wanted to bury me alive under a mountain of falsified science. Suddenly, a rhythmic click-clack of heels echoes in the hallway. A flashlight beam sweeps across the frosted glass of the door, cutting through my thoughts like a blade. I instantly kill the monitor, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating darkness, and retreat behind the chemical cabinets. My heart pounds, not out of fear, but from a searing, molten rage. Is someone there? Sienna's voice is sharp, dripping with a suspicion that borders on paranoia. The dry strike of her heels on the marble floor nears the scanner I just used. I hold my breath, my hand tightening around a vial of scopolamine antagonist I managed to snatch from the emergency cabinet. Through the narrow gap in the shelves, I see her. The light from her phone illuminates her meticulously made-up face, turning her into a beautiful, ruthless ghost. She brushes her hand against the slide tray. It's still warm from the LED light. I see her eyes narrow, the predatory instinct of a traitor sensing a leak. Adeline, you aren't in your room, she whispers to the empty air. There isn't a shred of concern in her tone, only the chilling frustration of a hunter who has realized the prey is no longer in the trap. She speed dials a number. Julian, wake up. Your corpse is crawling out of bed. She's in my lab. We need to escalate. Now. I stand frozen in the shadows, my back pressed against the cold, unforgiving wall. The vial in my hand feels like it weighs 1,000 tons. They don't just want me to die of a fake cancer. They want to erase my intellect, my memories, and my very soul before I can expose their crimes. This is no longer a medical diagnosis. This is an all-out war of attrition. I stare at the back of Sienna's head as she exits, feeling a cold resolve settle into my bones. The surgery to save my life hasn't even begun. But I have already identified the tumor, and its name is Miller. The most lethal predator in the wild isn't the one with the largest fangs or the loudest roar. It is the one who can play dead with such absolute perfection that the enemy feels safe enough to turn their back. Julian and Sienna want me to be their walking corpse? Fine. I will give them a performance that would make the finest stage actors weep with envy. Beneath this mask of chemical-induced stupor, my brain is performing a radical, unyielding surgery not on a patient, but on the layers of my own children's blackened hearts. The next morning, the Miller estate was submerged in a silence so thick it felt like drowning. I lay on my expensive silk bedding, a throne of luxury that felt more like a sacrificial altar. I had intentionally chosen a pale, slate-gray nightgown to emphasize the deathly pallor of my skin. This wasn't natural. It was the result of low-dose antihypertensive patches I had secretly applied to the soles of my feet at midnight. My blood pressure was bottoming out. my complexion sallow. I looked like a lamp flickering with its last drop of oil. It was an image convincing enough to deceive anyone, unless they possessed the veteran eye of a woman who had spent 40 years in the ER. The door creaked open. Sienna entered, the tray of medications in her hands rattling like a collection of shackles. She glanced at the packed suitcases in the corner, the remains of my life, boxed up for a journey I was never meant to return from. A flash of triumph crossed her face, a grotesque spark of joy in the eyes of a daughter-in-law waiting for a grave to open. "You've finally decided then, Mother?" she asked, her voice dripping with a fake, saccharine concern. "The private jet to Zurich is ready. The clinic there. They can offer you what we can't." I don't think I have a choice anymore," I rasped. I had spent the last hour dehydrating my throat to ensure my voice sounded like dry leaves scraping against a tombstone. Every word I uttered was calculated to sound like an agonizing effort. This hospital, my legacy. Just let Julian have it. I cannot bear to watch the empire I built crumble alongside my own body. A flicker of raw, naked ambition ignited in Sienna's eyes. She set the tray down with a clinical finality and drew a syringe. The clear liquid inside shimmered under the morning light, a beautiful, shimmering poison. "You've suffered enough, Adeline. This is just a light dose of morphine. It will make the transit to the airport more bearable." I looked at the syringe, then at her. I knew the viscosity of morphine. And this wasn't it. It was a cocktail of midazolam and scopolamine, the devil's breath. It wasn't meant to kill the body. It was meant to kill the mind. It was a chemical eraser, designed to wipe my memories and turn me into a vacant, drooling puppet, ready to sign whatever papers they put in front of me. "Thank you, Sienna. You've always been so thoughtful," I whispered, extending my withered arm. I felt the cold bite of the needle as she injected the betrayal directly into my veins. As the liquid entered, I began to count. 1, 2, 3. I felt the cold sensation racing toward my heart. The moment Sienna turned her back to dispose of the needle, my hand moved with a speed that defied my feigned fragility. I reached under the mahogany bed frame, where I had taped a preloaded syringe of flumazenil, the direct antagonist. I plunged it through my thigh bandages, feeling the sharp sting of the antidote. In my bloodstream, a silent, invisible war erupted. The chemical warriors of the antidote fought to keep my neurons firing, while Sienna's toxins tried to drown my consciousness in darkness. I forced my facial muscles to go slack. I let my jaw drop slightly, my gaze becoming vacant and unfocused. Julian entered a moment later, looking down at the corpse of his mother with a satisfaction so sickening it made my skin crawl. "Did she sign?" he asked. There wasn't even a shred of the respect he had feigned yesterday. He spoke as if I were already a piece of discarded medical waste. I nodded slowly, my hand trembling half from the drugs, half from the sheer effort not to wrap my fingers around his throat. I took the fountain pen. As I signed the power of attorney, I intentionally drew the letter A in Adeline, with a subtle, jagged, extra stroke underneath a secret distress signal I had established with my lawyer years ago for situations of legal duress. "Good. It's done then." Julian snapped the folder shut. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the leather was as dry and final as a coffin lid being hammered into place. "Sienna, get her to the car. We don't want to miss our flight to paradise." They led me out of my own home, like a piece of discarded furniture. As we passed the grand mirror in the foyer, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. A pathetic, broken old woman, flanked by her two loving caretakers. But deep within those hazy, half-closed pupils, the edge of a surgical blade was still sharp, glinting in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The SUV rolled out of the estate gates, the gravel crunching under the tires. In the heavy, pressurized silence of the car, Sienna suddenly peered into the rearview mirror. Her eyes narrowed. She reached over the seat, her fingers gripping my wrist with a predatory tightness to check my pulse. "Julian, stop the car," she hissed, her face contorting into a mask of pure panic. "Her pulse isn't slowing down." I injected enough to sedate a horse, but her heart rate is perfectly stable. It's too regular. Something is wrong." The silent play was shattered. Before I could even react, the cold, heavy steel of a handgun from Julian's hand pressed hard against my ribs, the barrel digging into the silk of my robe. "Mother." Julian's voice was no longer a son's. It was a low, guttural growl that sounded like it came from the depths of hell. "How long were you planning to play doctor with us?" I didn't open my eyes. I didn't flinch. I felt the barrel against my side, and in the silence of my soul, I gave him my answer. "The game has only just begun, my son, and unlike you, I never lose a patient I intend to save. You're going to die anyway, Mother. Just let this money secure my future." Those weren't the words of a son seeing his mother off to the gates of eternity. They were the guttural snarls of a vulture circling a prey that hadn't even finished drawing its last ragged breath. In that moment, Julian didn't just strip away his mask of filial piety, he incinerated it. Amidst the howling Boston blizzard, his heart seemed colder, more brittle than the jagged ice floes choking the Charles River. But he forgot one fundamental truth. A master surgeon always keeps the coolest head in the room, especially when standing before a tumor that has gone necrotic. The black SUV didn't head for Logan Airport as they had promised. Instead, it screeched to a halt in front of a secluded, fortress-like villa in the deep suburbs. This was a private care facility, a euphemism for a gilded cage of glass and reinforced steel, designed for the ultra-wealthy who needed to disappear from the world before their wills were read. Sienna led me inside, her hands gripping my elbows with the crushing force of a vice. I maintained my walking corpse facade, gaze vacant, eyes fixed on a point in infinity, letting them dump me into a heavy leather armchair. Inside my skull, a violent storm was raging. The nausea from the chemical clash between their sedatives and my hidden antagonists made my temples throb with a rhythmic, stabbing pain. Julian didn't even bother to remove his overcoat. He brought the freezing outdoor air right into my face, a physical manifestation of his coldness. He reached into a leather briefcase, pulled out a stack of documents thick enough to be a tombstone, and slammed them onto the glass coffee table. Crack! The sound tore through the haunting silence of the room like a bone snapping. "Look at this, Mother," Julian said. His voice was steady now, devoid of the pathetic trembling he'd exhibited back at the office. He had crossed the threshold into absolute, unadulterated cruelty. "This is the contract to transfer the entire Miller medical system to the Blackstone Group. Do you have any idea what they're offering? 3 times the current market value. They're buying your legacy, and they're paying in blood. I looked up at him, my lips twitching in a feigned, helpless speechlessness. But my eyes were recording everything. I watched the way he gripped his pen, the frantic way he licked his lips, the unmistakable physiological markers of a man consumed by an uncontrollable thirst for gold. Do you know why they're paying a premium? Julian laughed, a distorted, jagged sound that echoed off the glass walls. Because they don't want the hospital, Mother. They want the dirt. They're going to level Miller Medical to build luxury high-rises. Your life's work, sandpelled for real estate. And this money, it's enough for Sienna and me to live like royalty for 3 generations. I'll never have to touch a damn scalpel again. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. He was ready to sell the sanctuary where thousands had been saved, all for the sake of soulless digits in an offshore account. Sienna leaned in close, the cloying, suffocating scent of her expensive perfume filling my nostrils. It was nauseating. She whispered into my ear, her tone as sweet and thick as poisoned honey. Mother, let's be clinical. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer is an irreversible death sentence. You have weeks, maybe 2 months, of agonizing bone-deep pain left. If you sign this, we promise you the best palliative care in the world. You'll drift away in a peaceful, drug-induced sleep. No pain, no worries, just sleep. Under the harsh neon lights, my diagnostic eyes caught something they hadn't seen before. A subtle darkening of the skin around her neck acanthosis and a slight, rhythmic edema in her knuckles. These weren't signs of fatigue from caring for me. They were the classic markers of gestational hormonal changes. A molten rage flared deep within my gut. They were using an unborn life, my own grandchild, to harvest the tissue needed to forge my medical records. And now, they were using the word humanity as a shroud to rob me of everything I had built. You're going to die anyway, Julian repeated, his voice echoing hollowly in the sterile room. Let the money secure my future. Don't let it rot in the ground with your corpse. He shoved a heavy fountain pen into my hand. I took it with a grip that I made sure was dramatically, pathetically unsteady. I looked down at the contract, my eyes scanning the fine print with the speed of a computer. On the final page, under the Blackstone Board of Directors, I saw a name that made my blood turn to ice. It was a man I had personally fired for a catastrophic ethical violation a decade ago. This wasn't just a business deal. This was a perfectly orchestrated act of revenge, and my son was the lead executioner. I feigned a violent, hacking coughing fit, doubling over to hide the fact that I was checking the medical stats on the smartwatch hidden beneath my wide silk sleeve. My heart rate had spiked to 130. I had to force myself to stay calm. If I revealed a hint of my true lucidity now, Julian wouldn't hesitate to move from psychological warfare to physical force. Water. Please, water. I wheezed, my voice a mere thread of sound. Sienna huffed irritably and moved toward the minibar. The second her back was turned, my eyes darted back to the contract. Clause 4.2, a hidden shredder clause. All medical records of the current owner shall be deemed confidential and destroyed immediately upon completion of the transaction. They were going to incinerate the evidence of their forgery the moment my signature hit the cloak paper. They had calculated every move. Sienna returned with a glass, but she didn't hand it to me immediately. I watched her squeeze 3 drops from an unlabeled vial into the water. Drink this, Mother. Nootropics. It will help you stay sharp enough to finish this last signature. I took the glass, staring deep into her eyes. I saw nothing but a total, chilling void. No humanity, no medical ethics, just the cold vacuum where a soul should have been. I brought the glass to my lips, but at the last second, I feigned a massive tremor. I let the glass slip, spilling the drugged liquid and soaking the thick ivory pages of the contract. "My God, what have you done?" Julian roared, lunging forward to snatch the dripping documents. I collapsed back into the chair, my chest heaving, eyes rolling back as if I were entering a grand mal seizure. Medicine. Julian. I can't breathe. Sienna rushed over, her fingers probing my carotid and checking my pupils. I intentionally relaxed my extraocular muscles, creating a slight, asymmetric pupillary response. The classic blown pupil, sign of a massive stroke. "Damn it! She's having a stroke, Julian!" Sienna shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. "If she dies now, before the ink is dry, Blackstone walks away. We lose the payout." Julian looked at me, and for the first time, I saw his true face. It was filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't care about my life. He was mourning the loss of his blood-stained treasure. "Use the stimulants. Epinephrine. Get her back," Julian barked. "I don't care if it burns out her heart. She has to be conscious enough to sign. I don't care how long she lasts after that, but she must sign." In the darkness of my charade, I heard the clinical click of a syringe being prepared. I heard the ragged, animalistic breathing of my 2 children, now fully possessed by their demons. I knew I had just cornered myself into a genuine life and death struggle. Sienna didn't even prep the skin. She plunged the epinephrine needle through my robe and into my arm. The stinging heat of the chemical surge sent my heart rate skyrocketing like a missile. Through the haze of the drug, I heard Sienna's final, lethal whisper to Julian. "Let her sign. And then I'll give her the final dose. We'll report she died from cancer complications right after fulfilling her last wish to sell the hospital. No one will ever suspect a thing." I lay there, my heart thumping so hard I thought it would shatter my ribs, realizing that this humanitarian contract was nothing less than my own death warrant. Fine, I thought through the chemical fire in my veins. Let's see who signs the final execution order in this room. The best way to kill a patient isn't to pull the plug, it's to isolate them in a silence so profound that they can hear the rot of their own soul. Julian and Sienna had transformed this suburban treatment room into a glass coffin. Under the guise of palliative care, they had systematically severed every thread connecting me to the world I built. But they made a fatal, arrogant mistake. To a doctor, the quieter the room, the sharper the senses become. When you take away the light, the ears begin to see. The mechanical lock engaged with a dry, heavy click, followed by the chilling beep of an electronic security system. Julian had stripped away my freedom completely. The epinephrine surge he forced into my veins earlier had nearly sent my heart bursting through my ribs. And now, I was stabilized in a high-level ICU suite. But this wasn't for healing. The windows were reinforced, multi-layered, bulletproof glass. Every communication device, from my smartphone to the emergency call button, had been neutralized. I lay there, staring at the sterile, unforgiving white ceiling, feeling the negative pressure system suck every ounce of hope out of the room like a vacuum. Sienna entered. Clad in full medical protective gear, a white, rustling shroud that made her look more like a state executioner than a physician. She didn't speak. She coldly stripped the smartwatch from my wrist, the last tool I had to monitor my own survival. "You need absolute silence, Adeline," she said, her voice muffled by the mask. "Blue light from electronic devices will disrupt the circadian rhythm of a terminal patient. We can't have you agitated." I didn't resist. I looked at her with eyes I made sure were dull and glazed, letting her strip away my connection to the modern world. I watched her every move as she hung a fresh IV bag. The label had been torn off, a clear violation of every safety protocol. But as she squeezed the drip chamber, my clinical mind took over. The viscosity of the liquid was wrong. It was too thick, too oily for simple glucose. It was a high-dose sedative cocktail propofol or midazolam. They wanted to keep me in a twilight state, a conscious coma, until Blackstone finalized the legal slaughter of my hospital. "I'll be in the next room," Sienna said, her smile vanishing behind her surgical mask, leaving only the cold glint in her eyes. "If there's an event, I'll be the first to resuscitate you, or perhaps the last one to sign your autopsy report." The door closed, leaving me alone with the rhythmic, hypnotic tick-tock of the IV drip. 1 drop, 2 drops, 15 drops per minute. A rate precisely calculated to suppress my central nervous system without stopping my breathing yet. I sat up, my breath heavy and shallow. I began to scan every inch of my prison with the cold, diagnostic eye of a surgeon. The power outlet behind the bed showed microscopic scratches, signs of recent tampering. And then I saw it. A pinhole camera hidden in the smoke detector, its unblinking eye aimed directly at my bed. 24/7 surveillance. Any sign of true alertness now would be an invitation for a more permanent sedative. I knelt on the cold floor, pretending to search for something I'd dropped. In reality, I was reaching for the IV tubing running along the bed frame. I used my thumbnail to press with all my strength against the soft plastic, creating a microscopic, jagged tear. The sedative began to leak out, a slow, invisible puddle on the floor. Instead of entering my vein, I needed my mind clear. I needed to be a ghost in their machine. Suddenly, a financial news report filtered through the ventilation system from the next room. Blackstone Group announces a preliminary agreement to acquire Miller Medical. The signing ceremony is scheduled within 48 hours. 48 hours. My blood boiled. I had 2 days before they turned me into a literal corpse to legalize their paperwork. My only weapon was my own poisoned, battered body. Then I heard Julian's voice outside. He was on the phone, a cold, jagged laugh leaking through the door crack. "Yes, once Blackstone takes over, all lab data will be wiped. My mother is a genius, but she'll never suspect that the cancer tissue sample came from Sienna's own fetus." I stopped breathing. The world tilted on its axis. My chest felt as if it were being torn open by a blunt instrument, not from illness, but from the sickening, soul-crushing truth. My unborn grandchild. They had murdered it through a calculated abortion just to harvest chorionic tissue to forge my diagnosis. These monsters in white coats had sacrificed their own future, their own blood, for cold, hard cash. Hot tears streamed down my face, but they were the tears of a mother who had turned into a judge. My eyes burned with a lethal, icy fury. I looked at the SPO2 monitor, blinking a steady, rhythmic red on my finger. my final sliver of hope. If I could trigger a false physiological alarm on the hospital's central monitoring system, the automated security and the on-call residents would be forced to intervene under rapid response protocols. I began to tap the sensor in a rhythmic, intentional pattern, sending a distress signal in Morse code. Forgery. Each tap was a desperate heartbeat transmitted through the hospital's central server. I prayed that a technician at the monitoring station, someone whose soul hadn't been bought by Blackstone, would notice the erratic, rhythmic fluctuation in my oxygen saturation levels. It wasn't a medical glitch. It was a cry for justice from the heart of a grave. But before I could finish the last letter, the door burst open. Sienna stepped in, her face pale, her hands gripping a frequency detector that was screaming with a high-pitched electronic whine. "Adeline, what exactly are you doing with that monitor?" She lunged forward, her fingers like talons as she ripped the device from my hand. The game of hide-and-seek was over. The silence was gone. I was officially backed into a corner, and the executioner was standing right over me. Numbers don't lie. Only the ones holding the test results know how to manipulate the truth. Sienna thought that by seizing my oxygen monitor, she had effectively blinded me, turning my own hospital into a sensory deprivation chamber. But she made a fatal mistake. She forgot that this isolated room was once the original Miller family clinic. Beneath these ancient, cracked floor tiles lay a treasure trove of medical history they hadn't yet dared to clear away. Tonight, I will use the very blood they are systematically poisoning to write the indictment of their betrayal. After Sienna ripped away my monitoring equipment, I lay perfectly still, a statue of forced compliance. I let my breathing become shallow and rhythmic, pretending to have finally surrendered to the darkness they were weaving around me. Through the thin, clinical walls, I could hear them whispering in the hallway like grave robbers discussing the necessity of increasing my sedative dosage to ensure a peaceful transition. They thought I was exhausted, a fading candle in a storm. But in reality, the microscopic tear I made in the IV tubing earlier had saved me. With the toxins leaking onto the floor rather than surging through my veins, my lucidity had returned cold, sharp, and terrifyingly precise. I waited until the heavy, rhythmic thud of the night guard's footsteps faded into the distance before I dared to move. My body protested, every joint screaming from the chemical warfare inside me. The sting from the afternoon's forced injection still throbbed like a second heartbeat. But the primal will to survive overrode the physical agony. I rolled off the bed and knelt on the cold stone floor, the chill seeping into my bones. Using the jagged edge of a stainless steel spoon I had hidden under my pillow, I began to pry up a loose tile beneath the shadow of an old, rusted medicine cabinet. There it was. A personal emergency kit I had stashed here years ago, a relic from a time when I still trusted the walls of this institution. Inside, a few rapid test kits and a handheld biochemical meter appeared in the gloom like holy relics. I took a deep breath, steadying my trembling hands, and pricked my finger with a lancet. A drop of bright, crimson blood welled up a tiny, ruby light in the dark. I stared at it with a bitter, soul-crushing sorrow. This blood had once nourished Julian in my womb. Now, it was the only weapon left to expose the monster he had become. I carefully dropped the blood onto a pancreatic enzyme test strip. According to every biochemical law I had taught for decades, If I truly had terminal, obstructive pancreatic cancer, my ducts would be a disaster zone. My amylase levels should be skyrocketing, screaming past the thousands. The 3 minutes of waiting felt like a slow walk to the gallows. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Finally, the digital screen flickered to life, casting a ghostly green glow on my face. 85 UL. I froze. The breath left my lungs in a sharp hiss. 85 UL. It was perfectly normal, ideal. The markers of a healthy, functioning pancreas. A cold, visceral shiver raced down my spine, more chilling than the stone floor. There was no tumor. There were no metastases. The hospital reports, the soaring charts Julian had shown me, with tears in his eyes. Every single one was a fabricated performance, a masterpiece of digital forgery. They weren't just lying to me. They were deceiving the board, the legal system, and the entire medical community to turn a living woman into a terminal patient on paper. But what about the symptoms? The agonizing burning in my thurungvi, epigastrium, the racing heart that made me feel like I was constantly on the verge of a heart attack? I picked up the vial of the antagonist Sienna had left behind, squinting at the fine print under the dim, filtered moonlight. Another sickening truth emerged from the shadows. They were combining a forged record with actual, systematic poisoning. These weren't cancer pains. They were the symptoms of acute, chemically induced gastritis. They had been surreptitiously mixing high-dose corticosteroids into my tea every single day. They were creating real clinical suffering to validate a fake file. It was a plan so ruthless, so meticulously calculated. It was revolting. I slumped against the cabinet, gripping the meter until my knuckles turned white. Julian, you learned everything I taught you far too well, I whispered into the dark. But you used that knowledge to blacken your own soul. Suddenly, the desk phone in Sienna's station rang, the sound jarring in the silence. Through the wall, her voice filtered through crystal clear and devoid of any emotion. Yes, Blackstone representative. Professor Adeline's medical records have been fully synchronized. Her amylase levels are currently at a red alert stage. Yes, she's unlikely to survive the week. We are prepared for the final transition. She was lying through her teeth, selling my life for forged statistics and corporate favor. I looked at the dried blood on my finger, a crimson mark of my resolve. I couldn't wait for them to deliver the final transition. Normal amylase meant I still had a body capable of fighting back. I needed to get that 85 UL figure out of this tomb. My eyes locked onto the dripping IV bag, the rhythmic thump-thump of the fluid. If I could manipulate the chemical concentration in that bag, if I could induce a specific, non-lethal but alarming physiological reaction, I could trigger the central hospital's automated, rapid response alert. I would force the system to see me. The heavy electronic lock rattled. I barely had time to shove the kit back under the tile before Sienna stepped in. She was carrying a new bag of deep yellow fluid, total parenteral nutrition, TPN. But as she drew closer, the acrid metallic scent of high-dose chemotherapy agents filled the air. She wasn't feeding me. She was preparing the final chemical execution. Still awake, Mother? Her sharp, predatory gaze landed immediately on the base of the cabinet where I was still kneeling. Her eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you hiding under there?" She stepped closer, the sharp click-clack of her heels on the stone floor sounding like a countdown. She stopped exactly on the loose tile, her weight pressing down on my only hope. If she knelt down, if she moved that cabinet, every effort would vanish into smoke. "Adeline," she hissed, her voice dropping all pretense of kindness. "Don't make me use coercive measures. You're making this much harder for yourself than it needs to be." I looked up at her, my face a mask of frail confusion, while underneath, my mind was already calculating the exact dosage of the IV fluid I needed to sabotage. The doctor was still in, and she was about to perform the most dangerous surgery of her career. The line between a genuine, fatal anaphylactic shock and a perfect, calculated performance is measured in only a few milligrams of adrenaline and the sheer iron will of the person dying. Tonight, I am betting my life on a self-induced chemical chaos. Julian and Sienna want to isolate me in this glass coffin? Fine. I will force them to open the doors. I will force them to call for help. Not to send me to the graveyard they've already picked out, but to force the world to see the monsters hiding behind their surgical masks. Sienna stood over me, her needle-thin heels pressing firmly on the loose floor tile, the very spot where my secret testing kit lay hidden. Her gaze was reptilian, unblinking, monitoring my every breath for a sign of betrayal. One more second, if she knelt down to investigate the uneven floor, every ounce of my effort would vanish into smoke. I would be silenced forever before the sun rose. I had no time for hesitation. My life was now a game of seconds. Beneath the thin, clinical blanket, my hand gripped the IV bag I had sabotaged. Earlier, I had surreptitiously spiked it with a massive, concentrated dose of potassium chloride. To a layman, it's just a supplement. To a doctor, it is a lethal injection if delivered incorrectly. A sudden potassium surge would bypass my defenses, causing instant cardiac arrhythmia and extreme muscle spasms, perfectly mimicking the violent onset of acute anaphylactic shock. "Adeline, what exactly are you hiding under there?" Sienna hissed, her body beginning to crouch. I didn't answer with words. I pushed the dose into my vein through the loosened catheter. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Within seconds, my chest felt as if it were being crushed by a 1,000-ton slab of granite. My heart skipped a beat, then another, before spiraling into the chaotic, electric frenzy of ventricular fibrillation. I didn't have to fake the convulsions. My muscles were snapping like overwound springs. I felt the bitter metallic tang in my mouth as foam began to bubble at my lips. I utilized every trick of a veteran expert, intentionally tightening my laryngeal muscles to create the stridor, that haunting, high-pitched whistle of acute airway edema that signals the throat is closing shut. "Sienna! What happened? She's crashing!" Julian burst into the room, his voice cracking at the sight of the chaos. Sienna panicked. I saw her face distort in the overhead LED lights, her composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. She checked my pupils, her fingers trembling against my skin. "Impossible! I haven't given her the final dose yet." "Julian, look at her, she's cyanotic. Her lips are turning blue. Angioedema is setting in." Julian grabbed his wife's shoulders, shaking her with a violence born of fear, not love. "Inject epinephrine! Now! We can't let her die before she signs." "I can't." Sienna screamed, her face now as white as the sheets. If this is a drug interaction we don't recognize, more epinephrine could cause an immediate cerebral hemorrhage. We don't have a defibrillator here, Julian. Look at the monitor, it's redlining. Her heart is a bag of worms. I lay there, my consciousness fraying at the edges due to actual oxygen deprivation. Every breath was a jagged shard of glass in my lungs, but my hearing remained sharp, catching every panicked word. This was my gamble. I had created a clinical picture so complex, so fraught with legal and medical risk, that a coward like Sienna would never dare to treat it on site without a full crash cart. "Call 911!" Julian roared, his ambition finally colliding with the fear of a murder charge. Our private transport team? The Blackstone doctors? No. They're across the city. It'll take 30 minutes for them to get here. If she dies in this house, the coroner gets involved, and we can't explain the drug levels in her blood. Julian cursed, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he grabbed his phone. "I'm calling 911. We'll take her to General Hospital. They have emergency dialysis. We can flush the drug evidence out of her system during the resuscitation. We'll tell them it was an allergic reaction to her cancer meds." 10 minutes later, the wail of sirens tore through the suburban night, a sound that felt like a symphony to my ears. The ER team from General Hospital, people outside Julian's sphere of influence, people who still valued the oath, stormed into the room. As they loaded me onto the stretcher, a paramedic stared at the EKG strip and shouted to his partner, "V-fib! She's pulseless! Prep for defibrillation!" Julian and Sienna tried to board the ambulance, their faces masks of desperate control, but the paramedic blocked them with a firm, gloved hand. "Family stays in the car behind us. We need room to work." "Move!" The ambulance door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic thud. The world outside became a blur of blue and red strobes, pulsing against the frosted glass windows. As the vehicle lurched forward, I forced my eyes open. The paramedic was prepping an intubation tube, his face a mask of professional intensity. With the last ounce of my strength, I reached out and gripped his forearm. "No, cancer," I wheezed. The words were weak, a mere thread of sound, but they were crystalline. "Test. Amylase. Immediately." The paramedic froze, the laryngoscope hovering in midair. Before he could react or dismiss me as a delirious patient, I slipped a small, crumpled scrap of paper into his breast pocket, the paper I had hidden in my palm throughout the entire ordeal. Samples at Miller were forged. Check the DNA of biopsy AD70. I am being poisoned. The ambulance raced into the heart of the night, leaving Julian and Sienna frantically chasing behind in their luxury SUV. I knew I had just stepped out of the shadow of a quiet death into a much louder, much fiercer battle. The paramedic pulled the paper out, read it, and then looked back at me with an intensity that made my heart hammer again, but this time, it wasn't the potassium. It was hope. He reached for his radio, his voice hardening into a tone I recognized from the best soldiers in the ER. "Base, this is Unit 102. We have a witness incident on board. Priority 1. Request immediate police presence and a total lockdown of the ER entrance upon our arrival. Do not, I repeat, do not let the family members enter the trauma bay." Was he my savior? Or just another pawn moving across a board I didn't fully understand? I closed my eyes as the siren wailed above us. A lone woman clinging to a flickering, fragile hope in a world of white coats and black hearts. A single speck of dust can ruin a major surgery, and a single overlooked detail can topple an entire empire built on a foundation of lies. Julian and Sienna had calculated everything they intended to escort me straight from the ambulance back to a private operating room for the final step. To dispose of me through a surgery with no return. But they forgot one crucial, fatal thing. Boston General Hospital was hosting the International Congress of Pathology today. Instead of lying helpless on an operating table, I chose the lectern. Instead of a scalpel, I used the cold, unyielding light of a digital microscope to flay the skin off the treacherous kin standing before me. The auditorium was a sea of white coats and sharp minds, packed with the world's leading experts. The murmurs died down instantly as I appeared in a wheelchair, pushed by a bewildered orderly. I was still wrapped in stark white bandages. My skin pale, but my eyes burned with a terrifyingly lucid fire. Julian rushed forward, his face a distorted mask of panic, though he still tried to play the role of the devoted son for the flashing cameras of the reporters. "Mother, you're delirious from the shock. You've suffered a cardiac event," he shouted, his hands reaching for my wheelchair. "You need to go to the recovery room immediately." "Back off, Julian." I brushed his hand away with a strength that shocked him. My voice echoed through the high-fidelity speakers, sounding as cold and final as a judge's gavel striking a mahogany bench. "Colleagues, I am Adeline Miller. Today, I do not ask for your sympathy. I demand an open, cross-disciplinary consultation on my own medical records." Sienna froze at the edge of the stage, her expensive designer handbag slipping from her grip and hitting the floor with a hollow, dry thud. She knew then that the leash had snapped. Everything had spiraled out of her meticulous control. I signaled the technician to link the digital microscope system directly to the secure server of the Miller lab. Under the collective pressure of the world-renowned professors present, File AD 70, my death warrant, was forced onto the massive, high-definition screen. To the untrained eye, the images of pleomorphic, overlapping cell clusters looked deadly. A chaotic mess of biological destruction. "Look, Mother! You see it with your own eyes!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with a desperate, frantic excitement. He was a man drowning, clawing at the very water that was killing him. "The cancer cells are right there. How much longer will you deny the inevitable?" I smiled a smile so cold it could have chilled the marrow in his bones. I reached for the controls of the digital interface, magnifying a specific section of the tissue sample to 400x. "Look closely here, everyone." I pointed to the tiny, distinct granules scattered like stardust within the cells. These are zymogen granules. As every first-year pathology student knows, they only exist in perfectly healthy, functioning pancreatic acinar cells. A tumor that has supposedly metastasized to the final stage would be a wasteland of undifferentiated tissue. It would never, under any circumstances, retain such pure, specialized structures. The hall fell deathly silent. A heavy, collective realization began to rise from the front row of experts. I didn't stop. I continued, my voice as sharp as a laser lock, stripping away layers of deception. The forger of this specimen was too hasty. They swapped my tissue for a healthy sample, and then overstained it with cobalt-based dyes to deceive those with lesser expertise, to make healthy look deadly. on a quick scan. Julian recoiled, his body bumping into the podium with a dull thud. His face turned an ashen, sickly gray. And the most sickening part, the part that defies any shred of medical ethics, is here. I adjusted the focus to the very periphery of the sample, where the cellular border met the slide. The presence of fetal chorionic cells. My pancreatic biopsy somehow contains the DNA of a life that was stolen just last week. I turned the wheelchair slowly to look directly at the trembling Sienna. "Dr. Sienna, you never wanted this child, did you? To you, it was never a life, never a human being. It was just raw material used to perfect a forged file. You cold-bloodedly timed your own abortion to coincide with the day you took my biopsy. This wasn't a medical mishap. It was a criminal sacrifice offered to Blackstone to prove my cancer was real." An explosion of sound erupted in the silence. The sound of an empire of lies shattering into a million jagged pieces. Jeers and looks of utter visceral disgust were hurled at the two figures on the stage. Sienna quit, collapsed to the floor, sobbing into her hands. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were the tears of a cornered predator. Julian stood there like a hollow shell, his eyes blankly staring at the giant screen where his crimes were being flayed alive for the world to see. At that exact moment, the heavy doors at the back of the hall burst open as the police stormed in. Julian's face snapped. He suddenly burst into a maniacal, jagged laugh, pulling a concealed syringe from his lab coat and lunging at me with a terrifying, animalistic speed. "If I can't have Miller, then you won't live to enjoy it either." The gleaming needle, filled with a lethal cocktail I knew all too well, was only centimeters from my neck, cold, sharp, and filled with a son's final, murderous intent. A scalpel can excise a malignant tumor, but no instrument on earth can debride the rot within my son's soul. Julian stood before me, his face a distorted mask of desperation, clutching a syringe like a cornered butcher. He intended to use a lethal dose of potassium chloride, the same chemical used in judicial executions, to end my life right here in this auditorium, in front of hundreds of witnesses. But he forgot one fundamental lesson. I didn't just teach him how to hold a knife. I taught him that a true surgeon always has a backup plan for a failing operation. And for this family surgery, the time had come to amputate the necrotic parts to save the body. Julian's gleaming needle was mere millimeters from my carotid artery. I could feel the coldness of the steel radiating against my skin. The entire hall held its breath, a silence so heavy and pressurized that you could hear the frantic, uneven pounding of hearts. Security was rushing down the aisles. But they were too far. They were moving in slow motion compared to the twitching finger of a man who had lost his mind. Sienna remained slumped on the floor behind him, her eyes vacant and glazed like a porcelain doll with its strings severed. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I looked directly into my son's bloodshot eyes. Eyes that used to look at me with wonder when he was a child, and kept my voice unnervingly calm. "Inject it, Julian. Do it now. If you truly think one more needle can hide the truth from the thousands of expert eyes watching you in this room, then you are even more delusional than you are cruel." Julian's arm froze midair. He began to tremble, a violent, systemic shaking that rattled the syringe in his hand. The arrogance of the genius surgeon was screaming in a death struggle against the primal cowardice of a criminal caught in the light. "Mother, you forced me," he roared, tears finally breaking and streaming down his face, leaving tracks through the sweat and grime. "You always demanded perfection. You turned me into a shadow of yourself. I needed the money to be free. I needed to escape the suffocating ghost of Miller Medical." I gently, almost tenderly, pushed the needle away from my throat with the tip of my finger. "I taught you to use a microscope to find the truth and save lives, Julian. Not to blacken your conscience with deceitful chemicals. You say you wanted to escape my shadow, yet you chose to crawl through the sewers to betray the woman who gave you life. You didn't want freedom. You wanted the crown without the soul." The Boston police had now closed in, their weapons drawn but held low. The lead inspector stepped forward, his face grim, but I raised my hand to signal him to stop. I wanted to finish this surgery on my own terms. I reached under the bandages on my thigh and pulled out a small digital recorder, the final weapon I had guarded like a holy relic throughout my captivity. "Julian, listen closely. Listen to the sound of your own heart." A static hiss filled the auditorium speakers, and then the voices of Julian and Sienna echoed through the hall, cold and haunting. "Just let her sign the Blackstone papers. After that, I'll give her the final dose. She's dying anyway, Julian. Let this money secure our future. She's just a walking corpse now." Every word echoed like a scalpel flaying away Julian's last layer of human pretense. He collapsed to his knees, the syringe slipping from his hand and shattering on the stone floor. The clear, lethal liquid pooled around him, a chemical cocktail he had prepared to execute his own mother. "The medical records of the man whose CT scan you stole have been recovered," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, judicial finality. "He died because you intentionally hid his critical files to use for your own forgery. You didn't just legally kill your mother. Julian, you are a common murderer who traded a patient's life for a corporate payout." The inspector stepped in, the metallic click of the handcuffs onto Julian's wrists sounding like the final beat of a tragic symphony. Sienna was led away moments later, her head bowed as the crowd erupted in jeers and visceral disgust. I sat back in the wheelchair, watching my son, my only son, being pushed through the heavy auditorium doors. My chest ached with a physical weight, but it wasn't from the stimulants or the fake cancer. It was the bone-deep pain of a mother who had just performed the ultimate amputation, cutting her own child out of her life to preserve the sanctity of Wyduk medical ethics. "Professor Adeline, you need immediate stabilization," an emergency physician urged, his hand on my shoulder. "No." I stood up from the wheelchair, ignoring the protest of my muscles and the gasps of the crowd. "I need to return to the lab. There is a specimen that must be disposed of according to the highest biohazard protocol. The tissue of the poor child, whose very existence was stolen by these two, before it could even begin." I walked through the wreckage of my family's betrayal. As I passed the evidence table, a notification flashed on Julian's confiscated phone. It was an encrypted message from an anonymous Blackstone contact. "Transaction aborted. Scrub all traces or face the consequences." They had retreated the very second the police sirens wailed, as cold and professional as sharks scenting blood in the water. Julian and Sienna were merely chipped scalpels in the hand of a much larger assassin. The true hand holding the blade had retreated back into the shadows of the Blackstone boardrooms, waiting for the next hunt. Miller Medical will never belong to you, I whispered to the empty air, my hand gripping the stethoscope around my neck. I felt my own heart beating not with the frantic pace of drugs, but with a renewed, powerful, and defiant rhythm. Many believe that a few milligrams of synthetics or forged numbers on a glowing screen can control the trajectory of destiny. They measure, they calculate, and they pride themselves on mastering the life and death of others as if they were gods in white coats. But they forget one fundamental truth. Machines only measure speed, not endurance. A true physician's heart doesn't beat for the spikes on an EKG. It beats for the pride of living with integrity until the very last breath. The Boston sunrise reflected off the reinforced glass of the Miller Medical Center, its golden light dispersing the shadows that had suffocated me for a horrific week. I stood by my office window, watching the Charles River flow lazily toward the Atlantic. On my desk, there were no more forged CT scans, no more toxic tea, no more cancer reports stained with the ink of lies. In their place sat a real cup of Earl Grey, fragrant, pure, and absolutely devoid of the bitter aftertaste of conspiracy. The door opened with a soft, respectful click. Arthur, my loyal attorney and perhaps the only student of mine who truly understood the weight of an oath, entered with a stack of sealed documents. "Professor Adeline," he began, his voice low, "the detention orders for Julian and Sienna have been extended. The police are tracking a web of shadow transactions, but the Blackstone representatives are ghosts. They scrubbed every digital footprint the second the plan collapsed in the auditorium. They've retreated into the darkness, just as they appeared." I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling a sense of serenity spread through my veins like a clean IV flush. "Is it over?" "No, Arthur. Blackstone isn't an ordinary opponent. They are a systemic infection, merely waiting for the next host. But in medicine, excising the tumor is only the beginning. The postoperative phase, the recovery of the institution, is when we decide if the patient can truly stand again." I raised my hand, gently pressing my index and middle fingers against my radial pulse. 72 beats per minute, steady, powerful, defiant. There was no more epinephrine-induced tachycardia, no more scopolamine-induced lethargy. My body, through its own resilience, had purged the toxins injected by my own flesh and blood. "Mother?" A rasped, broken voice called from the doorway. I turned. Julian stood behind the reinforced glass of a temporary interrogation room set up within the hospital wing for the investigation. He looked pathetic, a hollowed-out version of the man I raised. The white lab coat that was once his pride was now wrinkled, gray, and stained by the very corruption he had embraced. In the adjacent room, I could hear Sienna's muffled, hysterical screams. She was blaming Julian for failing the timing, lamenting that the abortion hadn't been fresher for the biopsy, a level of depravity that chilled me to my very marrow. Julian looked at me through the glass, his lips trembling with a weak, desperate hope. "Did you ever truly love me, Mother? Or was I just another perfect specimen in your laboratory?" I looked at him in a long, heavy silence. My heart ached for exactly one beat, the final tribute to a son who no longer existed. But the reason of a surgeon who had held a scalpel for 40 years kept my voice as steady as steel. "Love does not mean condoning rot, Julian. I taught you to use a microscope to see the microscopic world. Yet you and Sienna used your own unborn child as raw material to finalize my death sentence. That is no longer greed. It is the ultimate metastasis of the soul. My mistake wasn't demanding perfection from you. It was believing that the Miller bloodline could inherently resist the virus of evil. I turned my back on him. I didn't let him see a single tear. In my world, we don't cry over tissue that has already been amputated. As I walked down the main hallway, the sea of white coats parted. Doctors, nurses, and residents stood aside, bowing their heads in a silence that was loud with respect. The decisive click-clack of my heels on the marble floor erased the haunting echoes of the ambulance from that night. I stopped before the grand entrance, looking up at the sign, Miller Medical Center. A scalpel can remove a tumor, I whispered to the quiet air, but only the truth can heal the wound of betrayal. I took the stethoscope from around my neck and placed the cold diaphragm against my left chest. The rhythmic lub-dub sounded clear, pure, and resonant, a symphony of rebirth. This was the heartbeat of a woman who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, armed only with her knowledge and her dignity. Schedule the pancreatic transplant for this afternoon, I told my new secretary, my voice projecting with newfound authority. And ensure every biopsy specimen in this building is cross-checked by 3 independent laboratories. At Miller, we will never allow deception to take root again. Not while I still breathe. I stepped into the locker room and donned a pristine, starch-white lab coat. I was no longer a walking corpse. I am Adeline Miller, the woman who just performed the most agonizing surgery of her life, cutting away her own kin to preserve the heartbeat of integrity. I pushed open the heavy double doors to the operating room. The shadowless surgical lights shone brilliantly ahead, blinding and pure. "Let's begin," I said, stepping into the light. Life doesn't wait for cowards.